Most people are now aware that eating lots of vegetables, especially leafy greens, is beneficial to our health. Unfortunately, buying enough vegetables for good health can be too expensive for many low-income families. Growing vegetables in home kitchen gardens is often promoted as a solution. This strategy hasn't always lived up to its promise. Most of these efforts focus on a handful of well-known vegetables, such as tomatoes, cucumbers, spinach, lettuce, peppers, and carrots. A serious obstacle for tropical gardeners is that seed for these crops usually needs to be bought each year. This can be too expensive for many low-income families. This is especially true for hybrid, organic, and genetically modified seed. In addition to being expensive, the availability of locally adapted seed varieties is very limited in much of the tropics. Browsing through mail-order seed catalogs is rarely an option. Another problem is that seed can quickly lose viability in hot and humid environments. This presentation will show some techniques for growing bumper crops of high-nutrition leafy vegetables in small home gardens, all while keeping the cost of buying seeds to a minimum. 4 of the best ways to get leafy vegetable plants for free or nearly free are saving your own seed, transplanting volunteer plants, making stem cuttings of perennial plants, and dividing the roots of perennial plants. Commercial vegetable seed production is a complex art, especially if you're trying to develop plant varieties with particular traits. Fortunately, many plants with nutritious leaves produce abundant seeds that can be easily saved with little concern for maintaining genetic purity. These include hyacinth or loblob beans and wing beans, Seminole pumpkins and loofah gourds, amaranth, and quailgrass. Most seeds are easiest to save on a clear, dry day when the seed pods are fully mature, but before they've opened or are showing any signs of mold. You can make sure your seeds are dry enough to store for next season by putting some of them in a sealed jar with a teaspoon of salt. If the seeds are not dry enough, some salt will cling to the side of the jar and to the seeds. If the seeds are adequately dry, the salt will just sit in the bottom of the jar. In gardening, volunteers are useful plants that grow on their own without being intentionally planted. If they're not useful, they're usually called weeds. The most common source of these garden volunteers is probably annual plants from the past season, dropping their seed into fertile soil. Another good source is when plants sprout up around the edge of compost piles from last season's discarded plants. Almost without fail, we get plenty of these free sets from vine spinach, quailgrass, Hopi amaranth, cleome, jute, loofah, and several other vegetable crops every spring. Not only are volunteers free, but they've already figured out when to sprout in your location. The crowded young plants can then be carefully dug up and transplanted where they have enough room to grow, as with these loofah gourd volunteers on the edge of a compost pile. We usually will water the transplants well, then mulch around them and provide them with shade for at least a few days until they can become rooted into their new home. Just these 2 loofah volunteers grew this wall of foliage and yielded about 2 dozen gourds. One of my favorite ways to get new leafy vegetable plants with no cost is to make stem cuttings from perennials. This is very easy to do with a big variety of perennials that have high nutrition leaves. Ibeca, chaya, katuk, longevity spinach, and moringa are 5 of the easiest plants to reproduce from stem cuttings. Before you start getting cuttings, it's a good idea to dip your tools in a 10% solution of household bleach. This greatly reduces the chance of transmitting plant diseases. For most of these plants, we take a cutting of about 8 or 10 inches from a healthy, actively growing stem. We then trim off most of the leaves. A few left at the top are okay. Make sure you plant your stem cutting with the growing tip facing up. We often start new stem cuttings in large plastic cups. Make sure they have good drainage in the bottom and fill them with potting soil. Push the cutting in as far as it will go and press the soil firmly around it. Then water well. Moringa can be easily started from either seeds or stem cuttings. We usually take stem cuttings about 3 feet or 1 meter long and plant them directly in the soil, with about 1/3 of their length below ground. Here's a tray of stem cuttings ready to go, and the leaves that were stripped off them ready to go to the kitchen. We usually will let these stem cuttings grow and root in their cups for a couple of months before they're planted out in the garden or field. Another way to get free perennial plants is by root division. Some plants with edible leaves, like garlic chives or malanga, will grow until they're overcrowded. You can alleviate this overcrowding by digging them up, carefully separating the roots, and replanting them with more room to grow. They'll benefit from a good drink of water and some shade until they can form new roots in their new location. One of the most enjoyable and most rewarding aspects of gardening can be sharing the bounty of your garden with friends and neighbors. This is especially true with sharing the seeds, volunteers, stem cuttings, and root divisions that can get an abundant garden growing while bypassing the cost of expensive seeds. Thanks for watching.